Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. I'm Þórir and today I'm going to try to briefly analyze the cultic behaviors, rituals and symbology expressed in the 2022 movie The Northman, directed by Robert Eggers. Some of you may say I come a little bit late to this, and you may be right. However, I only do things when I decide to do them. That's how I have been trying to live my life. Whenever I'm ready to do something, I'll do it. I was very sick with COVID, as some of you already know, so I gave the movie a try, and frankly, I am not disappointed. Certainly, when we watch movies that deal with a particular culture and historical period, it's always best to try to see it as a movie, as entertainment, and not as a faithful depiction of the historical context. Otherwise, every movie within this genre will be ruined. It's like watching the 13th Warrior and reading the book from which it was inspired, Eaters of the Dead. If we are fervently looking for the rights and wrongs in terms of depicting the historical content and material cultures, forget it. That particular movie, in such terms, is a disaster. However, if we look at it as entertainment, the action, the fantasy, the adventure, then it is a pretty cool movie and still one of my favorites to this day, possibly on the top 20. Now, concerning Robert Eggers' movie, The Northman, we have something else in our hands, something far more complex and thought through. So I'll spare a few words concerning this before we really jump into the main content of this video. Upon watching The Northman, in my opinion, of course, it is on the top 10 movies which are as faithful to the historical content as possible. It's not perfect, but it is understandable because we are dealing with entertainment and not a history lesson. When I saw the trailer for the first time, I had already clocked quite a few accurate elements in clothing, weaponry, architecture, and so on and so forth. It is indeed surprisingly accurate in many ways. However, this is not the fact that led me to be surprised, positively surprised with the movie when I saw it. The movie in question doesn't just focuses on the material culture. It does something that is very risky for filmmakers, which is focusing on the social religious factor and the psychology of religion and of belief systems and how that human cognitive process is reflected on material culture and behaviors. That is something far more complex, and on those terms, I think the movie is especially good. Very attentive to details, some of which are tiny details and crucial. Sorry. This is a rather risky move, in my opinion, as I said, because if the public is not familiarized with the cults, rituals, belief systems, folklore, mythology, symbology, all the human psychological factors that are built through thousands of years of human interaction with nature and the development of the cognitive landscape, that is, the cultural development of a symbolic medium that is created by the human action of assigning meaning to nature and the environment, which is shaped from social beliefs and values. If people are not familiarized with this, then they cannot fully appreciate the movie and what is being told, what is being portrayed, and the cultural depth in great part will be totally missed. So I think this is a movie that requires a little bit of background on those terms, otherwise it will look like a bunch of people high on testosterone, and when they don't know how to communicate by shoving an axe on someone's head, they will act like absolutely deranged animals. And the more weird it gets, the better they seem to understand each other. I think I'm not wrong when saying what I've just said. And this is one of the main reasons why I have enjoyed the movie, because it goes much further than just the external and material reality. If you take my meaning. It also focuses on the symbolic nature of Iron Age Scandinavia and early Nordic Middle Ages, which is especially brutal and complex. And anyone who isn't aware of such cultural backgrounds will certainly not enjoy the movie as much as someone who can identify what is being depicted. This is what I would like to talk about in this video today. I am quite certain there must be plenty of videos out there and written posts and blogs all over the place and all over the internet about the material culture within this movie, the historical accuracies and inaccuracies in the movie The Northman. So I don't want to explore that because I think that is the easiest part. I want to delve into the complexity of the rituals, symbols, and the social religious behaviors depicted in the movie. Because one thing is the accurate depictions of access of the period. It's cool, good attention to detail. It shows sensibility towards the actual weaponry used both in this cultural context and in this period. But another thing is the animal symbols, the designs of beasts and monsters and hanged man on trees, sorcery, witchcraft, magic, religious paraphernalia, temples, deities, etc. But I would just like to reinforce that I was pleasantly surprised with the clothing, armor, weapons, architecture, and so on and so forth here depicted in this movie. An example I found to be a demonstration of being sensitive enough to be attentive to detail is, for instance, as an example, is the helmet Fjolnir is wearing. Yes, spoilers alert, even though I may actually be one of the very few human beings on Earth that only saw the movie after almost a year of its release. Anyway, Fjolnir's helmet is the same as the Jólarbundbo helmet, and until 2020, if I'm not mistaken, this was the only Viking-era helmet found. The representation is quite faithful to the original finding, although in the original Visitor there are no holes to put on a chain mail. Speaking of Fjolnir, I also take the opportunity to quickly respond to some patrons of mine and others, other people around here, some of you here in this channel who had some doubts about this and pointed out in the comments of some videos of mine, but I couldn't answer because I hadn't seen the movie yet. We see Fjolnir with a sword that has only one blade, one-sided blade sword or a single-edged sword. This is historically accurate. It's a Viking Age type sea sword, early 9th to 10th century. I recommend a good source to check several of these swords and many more, which is the book Swords of the Viking Age, that's it, by Ian Pearce. This particular part also has another rather curious detail, which are Fjolnir's companions. They seem to be people closest to him, like a personal guard, who wear masks that remind me of animal masks like the ones in the Museum of Ætabo, former Hedvi. Of course, we don't know yet the purpose of such masks. The function is still uncertain. However, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine referred in his book of ceremonies to a Gothic dance performed by members of his personal Varangian guard, who took part wearing animal skins and masks, reminiscent of the depiction of warriors wearing animal customs and depicted in Swedish helmet plates. To be more precise, the Torslunda plates, which we shall speak of further ahead, which date to the Vandal period, just before the Viking Age. It is a curious detail. We don't see this depicted in other movies, especially dealing with the early Viking period, so I think it is a fine observation. But anyway, I thought it would be worth referring to these little, huge details. But what I really want to do today is to delve into the symbology and rituals. So let's do this. Let's get started, my dear friends, if you please. Behold, nerd stuff ahead. Let us start with animal symbology concerning ravens, which are the first animals to appear right at the beginning of the movie. Two ravens, I think there is no point in showing you images from the movie concerning ravens, because along the movie they are by far the animals that appear the most. Ravens, very popular birds of prey in legends and myths in the northern hemisphere, are often depicted as birds of ill omen. However, in the Norse culture of the Viking Age, crows, ravens did not necessarily have a bad connotation in the sense of bringing some ill fortune or a curse, but they were birds associated with war, since due to their scavenging habits, it was not uncommon in a field of battle full of fresh corpses seeing some ravens there, so they are often portrayed as feasting on corpses. On the other hand, ravens are also very intelligent animals and even manage to express themselves in an almost human way, trying to imitate or reproduce words from human vocabulary when we interact with them. In the case of Norse mythology, the most famous ravens were Hugin and Munin. Both belong to Odin, the god Odin, being used by the god to spy on the world and its inhabitants, collecting information, and then they would report it to Odin, communicating in his ear. In this aspect, Hugin and Munin do not evoke ill omen or martial symbolism, but are associated with intelligence, knowledge, even more so considering that their names mean possibly thought, Hugin, and memory, Munin. We are facing a pair of auxiliary animals with regard to the knowledge acquired by Odin, or in other words, they are a means by which Odin obtains knowledge. However, ravens also have a martial symbolism, something that comes mainly from two aspects. The first was their association with the battlefields, acting as scavengers. The second was, as I said, the fact that Odin, a deity associated with war and warriors, has two ravens, or two raven companions. The god himself was also known by the epithet of Rafnagud, a raven god. So the movie opens with two ravens flying over the sea, heralds of the king's return, which may be an allusion to Hugin and Munin. In addition, the character of King Horvandil is known by the epithet of War Raven, something that clearly evokes the symbolism of battle, war, carnage, and the idea of royalty being specially dedicated to the cult of Odin. Royalty having a favoritism for Odin, as we understand it from literary sources and some material culture. And in different moments of the plot, the protagonist, Amleth, sees ravens all over the place. They seem to follow him, and he considers that such birds would be omens of sorts, indications of his father who watched over him. But it could also be a sign from Odin himself, as Hugin and Munin watch over humanity, and some literary accounts say that Odin intervened to help some esteemed warriors that he favored. And since the plot is based on the question of revenge and fate, it makes sense, considering that Hamlet, by accepting his fate, hoped to prove himself worthy of going to Valhall, Odin's hall. Because of this, the ravens watching him was a sign that the god of warriors, of royalty, or the god of royal birth is watching him. There is even an important scene in the film which clearly suggests that the god could have helped the character to continue his destiny, when later in the film Hamlet is a prisoner of Fjolnir and a character appears dressed in a way that demonstrates the presence of Odin. And Hamlet himself sometimes gives indications of being devoted to Odin. So, now let's start with the scene when King Horvandil returns from grocery shopping. When he arrives and enters his hall, he is greeted by several people holding up a ring in their hands, possibly arm rings or ring bracelets. We know that such objects were used to make oaths, to swear oaths upon, There are even indications of sacrificing these objects to certain deities, such as the deity Hullur, and that such arm rings would serve as an ex-Voto, a votive offering. However, what I would like to focus on here is the attention to detail. I think there is no doubt that this scene was based on the famous Tänglagårda stele from the island of Gotland in Sweden, where several men and a horseman carry a ring very close to three images of Valknuts. We are therefore, it seems, viewing a representation of this stele, a funerary monument or a memory monument, a memorial monument. As has been said in excavations of sacred sites in pre-Christian Scandinavia, large rings were recovered, and we know from the sagas how they were used for oaths, agreements, alliances, and bonds, as well as magical objects related to the gods, such as Odin's ring, an object from mythology. Then, 5 minutes and a half in, along the eastern wall of the hall, or let's say along the right side as one is facing the high seat, we see a long tapestry, which is an almost faithful reproduction of the Osberg tapestry, 9th century. This is particularly important because such tapestries were hung in the halls and houses of the lords and represent religious and mythological scenes linked to the life of the Scandinavian aristocracy as well as to their cults and rituals, being therefore representations of the religious, spiritual, mythological and symbolic in the panorama of the elites. In particular, there is a focus in some parts of the film on the tree of the hanged man that we also see in this tapestry. Namely, we will see later in the movie in Fjolnir's house on his farm in Iceland a focus on this tree of the hanged man, where in the movie we can see the dead people hanging from the tree and the quadrifoil symbol on the right side, just like in the original tapestry, but the swastika that originally appears at the left base of the tree has been removed, evidently to avoid problems with the current supremacies of the USA and Europe and the misuse of such religious symbols. However, it should be noted that the swastika in Scandinavia at the end of the Iron Age was associated with Odin, and this detail, including the tree of the hanged, gives us indications of the cult of Odin that was more prominent in social spaces of the Scandinavian elite, the aristocracy. This scene of the tree with the hanged man will serve as a visual paradigm for the entire movie. In the tapestry, the dead seem to float on the branches, and, an idea that the director will masterfully exploit, in my opinion, in which the tree scene will serve as a family tree showing the ancestors, descendants, and future descendants of this royal lineage. I think it was an interesting idea, although in the original tapestry it's man sacrificed and hanged from a tree in a grove of serpents. This is something characteristic of the cult of Odin and of those who were sacrificed to him. But I also think that this idea of transforming this tree into a family tree is quite intelligent because as we are dealing with iconographic elements in relation to the cult of Odin, it should be noted that the cult of Odin was mostly restricted to the elites, the Scandinavian aristocracy or nobility. As I said in a previous video, and actually it wasn't on purpose that I made a video about the cult of Odin and where I have touched precisely on these points and showed you and talked about the tapestry here in question. And actually I am happy with myself for having made this video because it came in handy. The fates have aligned. But as I said in the previous video, the cult of Odin in the Viking Age, which you can see right here on this information icon in this right upper corner. In the movie, we continue to see references to Odin both in relation to King Aurvandil and Hamlet, which are clearly Scandinavian aristocracy. So, as I said in the previous video, there is a clear favoritism for Odin from the part of the Scandinavian aristocracy, and this favoritism stems from the belief that kings are descended from Odin, legendary kings as well as legendary warrior heroes who trace their descent to Odin. In a way, it is a mythological genealogical belief we often find depicted in the literary sources, in the Volsunga saga, as an example. Odin as a god of those who die in battle and go to Valhalla. But Odin was the god of especially the dead by violent death, primarily the dead in battle, the warriors of the elite who were the descendants of Odin, meaning the members of the royal families who venerated their own ancestors in Odin himself. As I said, Scandinavian aristocracy traced their legendary lineage to the god Odin himself. So this particular belief that was very rooted within the aristocracy, and so the material culture within the space of the elite, which would reflect this devotion towards Odin, we see several allusions to the Odinic cult in tapestries. And we have the same thing in the movie. There is a play here with the genealogical belief of Scandinavian kings being the descendants of Odin, transporting this idea from the tree of the hanged as an iconographic symbology of the Odinic cult itself. And in the movie, the hanged men are transformed into past, present, and future members of this royal lineage, of which the main character Hamlet belongs to. This was quite clever, and it is these details that make this movie quite rich in terms of the culture here portrayed and the belief systems and religious symbology. After this scene, almost 10 minutes in, we see the king and his son walking towards a temple. We see the king bathing a ring in blood. We also get to see several representations of deities along the temple, and at its head, the main representation is of Odin, the god Odin. As I said in the video concerning religious practice in Nordic paganism, there aren't enough details to faithfully represent the rituals performed within a Viking Age temple. I reinforce that the most extensive description of Viking Age Scandinavian religious practices comes from the 11th century German Christian chronicler Adam of Bremen, and he described a temple at the Swedish capital of Gamla Uppsala, which is fairly late in the culmination of Scandinavian Iron Age, where we already see several Christian influences in that period, the 11th century. So far, the temple in question at Old Uppsala has not been discovered, not yet, although the surrounding area is filled with burial mounds dating back to as far as the Bronze Age. And we clearly have an important religious space, but no trace has been found of the building described by Adam of Bremen. Elsewhere, evidences of pagan temples of the Scandinavian Viking Age are largely absent, but recently there's been found a couple of temples from that period, so we know there wasn't a total absence of pagan temples in this context, but it isn't certain how much of a pagan practice this really was, and if it was customary for pagans of this period to raise temples, or if it was simply in very distinct spaces ruled by a wealthy lord who raised these temples following the Christian tradition of having churches, because these temples really are from a very late period and with heavy Christian influences in the social and religious panorama of Scandinavia in these periods since before the official Christianization. The main pagan scheme, let's say, of places of worship was usually on prominent landscape features and raising altars and cairns, but temples in Scandinavia wasn't that common, it would seem. It is also important to point out that numerous places in Iceland include in their name the element hoof, temple. But whether there was a specific building for such use is far from being proven in the Icelandic context. One thing is Scandinavia, and another thing is Iceland. The concept of temple from place to place and from period to period clearly had different understandings. For the Icelandic context, we have only two descriptions of a supposed pagan temple, a heathen temple, and they derive from two sagas. One composed during the 13th century, the Herivia saga, the other in the 15th century, the Hjörnarsinga saga. I suggest you read these two sagas to get a sense of how a temple is described in an Icelandic context, but once again, don't forget that not only we are not dealing with a Scandinavian context, but also that they are very late sources, one from the 13th century and the other from the 15th century. The earliest account of these two, Erevia saga, was written more than 200 years after Christianization was accepted in assembly as the official religion of Iceland, and the other saga is largely based on this earlier one. There's no point in going into details as I've presented these sources on the previously mentioned video. So if you have the time, of course, and patience, please watch it. The thing is, what we have here in the movie is also largely based on those sagas, which the sagas themselves describe a heathen temple not by actually having seen it, but imagining how it must have been, but largely created from a Christian perspective of what a heathen temple would have looked like. And if you read these sources, you will definitely see that the description of the temple is actually a description of a Christian church reimagined as a pagan temple. But what really caught my attention in this temple scene in the movie was something else. There is a door behind the statue of Odin which leads into an underground passage. I knew something peculiar would happen here because of the choice of the figure carved on the door. It is very reminiscent of a wonderful finding which is a stone found in Cumbria which depicts a bound figure, perhaps Loke, or has been interpreted by several authors as to be a representation of the trickster spirit of Old Norse myths and folklore, Loke. This is a 10th century Viking Age carving on stone in the English county of Cumbria, which can very much be a representation of Loke as a bound figure which we know from the myths. However, this is a finding in a Christian context on display on the churchyard. A carved figure with horns, a beard, a belt, and chains, Loki bound with his own son's entrails. On this particular finding, we are in the presence of an element of pagan myth turned into a tool to portray the Christian devil. This was very common by this period and other periods since, picking up elements of pagan beliefs to convey Christian religious teachings, myths, and morals to aid in the conversion of the pagans. In this case, to facilitate the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons. Still, it is a peculiar choice for a carving on a door, and we get further proof of the intention to depict Loke further ahead in the underground. Soon after, King Aurvandil and his son participate in a ritual imitating wolves and drinking a potion with hallucinogens on the ground. As soon after, both have visions and enter a kind of trance. They obey the command of a man wearing a mask similar to the one found on the hull of a vessel in Hedby that we will see here on the screen. But I find it peculiar that the figure is nothing more than Heimir, the fool portrayed by Willem Dafoe. The first time we see Heimir is precisely in the hull and as a gesture, like the fool of the court. Then we see here in this scene as the figure who will initiate Hamlet. Now, taking into account the figure at the door, it is funny to see that the figure of Heimir is both the gesture as well as the bearer of initiatory secrets. In the sources, Loki is also often interpreted both as the gesture in the whole of the gods and also as a separate, darker and more obscure figure bearer of great magical wisdom, the trickster spirit, the shaman cultural hero. And if you have the time, once again, I invite you to watch the video I made about Loki, where I've touched on several points in relation to this figure, mostly as a trickster spirit. But, as I was saying, once again, we have the depiction of a mask that has been talked about here before, probably used for ritualistic purposes in connection with animalistic behavior in ritual ceremony. Of course, both the king and his son here act like dogs or hounds or wolves howling. This particular scene was inspired by the Volsungar saga, 13th century, where King Sigmund and his son Singfjotli wear wolf skins and imitated the behavior of these animals in a forest. We know that among many warriors since the Iron Age, it was common to use as clothing or ceremonial costumes the fur, tusks and teeth of bears and wolves and also wild boars, more or less a totemic animals to the god Odin, and boars more related to the Vanir, especially to the god Freyr. But we have no way to directly verifying their historical existence in an aristocratic and royal context. Also, the use of psychotropics in Nordic rituals is also very controversial in the pre-Christian Scandinavian and Nordic studies, and there is no consensus in this regard. In another scene, the film will make reference to Amanita muscaria, the mushroom associated with Nordic trances, since the 1960s, 20th century. But historical proof of its use in the Viking Age is not yet possible. In order to not waste too much time, I apologize, but once again I invite you to watch another video I've made totally dedicated to the Bare-serkir and Hulfednar, bear skins or bear shirts and wolf coats, respectively, where I also touch on this aspect of hallucinogens in relation to these warriors. But we will talk a little more about them later on in this video. Also, a particularly interesting dialogue between these characters is when King Horvandil asks, "How did Odin lose his eye?" At which his son replied, "To learn the secret magic of women." And his father says, "Never seek the secrets of women, but heed them always." And Heimir, initiating the young pupil into this secret, says, "It is women that know the mysteries of man, the Norns that spin and weave at their well of fate." This is the entire premise of Seiðmaðr, a Nordic type of magic mainly as a series of methods for divinatory and prophetic purposes. Here a man must not seek it, but heed it always. This is in reference to the idea that Seiðmaðr was mainly women's magic and that it was shameful for a man to practice it. Although that didn't stop many men from practicing it, and we shall have a reference to this further on in this movie, because things were never black and white, and men did practice what was considered women's magic, just like Odin himself, the god Odin, sought to know the secret magic of women, and he himself was a well-known practitioner of Seiðmaðr and other feminine magical arts. I would like to point out that in this initiation scene we can have a glimpse into the animal symbology of the dog. The dog was one of the most common domestic animals in Scandinavia since antiquity, being used for hunting, protection and company. However, the Norse also used dogs in funeral rites, sacrificing them and eating their flesh. In the case of the movie, the dogs stand out in two moments in the plot. The first occurs when Amleth and his father participate in an initiation rite conducted by Heimir. The ritual takes place in a cave below a temple, as we have seen previously. During the process, Heimir asks if young Hamlet was a dog or a wolf. I think it is an interesting question because it refers to a symbolic question. Wolves represent the wild canine, but the dog is the domesticated canine. The dog for the ancient Norse was an animal that symbolized protection and loyalty, characteristics shared by other peoples and cultures as well, of course, obviously. However, Heimir's question refers to the condition that, in the context of the movie, the dog represents loyalty and submission. This becomes clearer, I think, when we connect the question to Queen Gudrun's speech, who previously asked her son if he would be a chief or a king like his father, or a puppy or cub. I don't quite remember if it was puppy or cub, but here the word puppy or cub would go back to the idea of being a puppy, a young dog, of being someone submissive. But a king must not be submissive, but just like the dog, it should protect and be loyal to his family. At another point in the movie, when Hamlet already begins his revenge, mushrooms are used to poison the food of the guards and dogs of his uncle's farm, Þórir. During the night, men and animals, due to the hallucinogenic effects caused by the mushrooms, become desperate and aggressive. The guards are absolutely baffled, but the dogs rebel against their owners. The event symbolically serves to break down the idea of dogs as loyal and protective animals, portraying them as threats, as capable of being savage and quite violent as well. And this matches the purpose of the plot, as it addresses betrayal and revenge. So Hamlet turns dogs and masters against each other, but also the fact of changing behavior to something more violent and uncontrolled, as we will see later on in relation to the symbology of the wolf and the bear. Hamlet, before accepting his destiny of revenge, is sort of half asleep, a dog, and his ferocity is awakened, becoming a bear wolf. We then continue on to the land of the Rus. We see Hamlet grown up, portrayed by Alexander Skarsgård. The Volga River and its tributaries were heavily navigated at these times for the slave trade, mostly the sale of enslaved women for prostitution. But well, here we see another ritualistic moment when Hamlet finds himself in the east, in the land of the Rus. Several Bare-serkir and Hulfednar sing and dance, shout and howl around a campfire or a bonfire. As mentioned earlier in the video about the cult of Odin, we know that there were warrior cults linked to certain elaborate movements and dances. Figurations on bracelets and plaques on helmets from the 5th and the 7th centuries attest to this. Again, Constantine Porphyrogenitus, already mentioned here before, 10th century, describes Varangians ritually dancing in the celebration of Yule. But we don't know how these rituals actually were, how long they lasted, and what was done in them. In fact, here in this film by Robert Eggers, due to the lack of evidences about these dances, it seems to me that there was an adaptation using information about North American indigenous warriors in their rituals for war. Everyone dances almost naked or semi-nude around a bonfire, making circular movements, and at times they stop and shout or even chant war cries, similar to what we see here in the movie. But the most intriguing symbology at this point is an individual who imitates or embodies the deity Odin. Therefore, in the same context, we have another detail of the iconography of a Scandinavian culture, an older individual figure, blind or perhaps in a trance, imitating the god Odin. He wears a horned helmet and holds 2 crossed darts or javelins. I saw some comments on some online groups making fun of this in particular, saying that supposedly this is a film based on more on historical facts, but there is a Viking helmet with horns. Okay, we have to be careful with this because not everything is black and white, and although we know that battle helmets in the Viking era really didn't have horns, we can't let that historical fact be decisive for all contexts, because we run into the risk of eliminating important details of past cultures that continue to have an influence in the Viking Age. In this figure, we clearly have an inspiration in the figures of the Torslunda plates found in Sweden and dating from the Vandal period, a time before what we call the Viking Age. The Vandal period is more or less between the 6th and the 8th centuries of the Common Era, between the Migration period and the Viking Age. Horned helmets is an image that is found on several pendants and also on the Osberg tapestry, 9th century. Several researchers have been considering the possible existence of dramatizations and performances in ancient Norse rituals. A person would incarnate a god, in this case Odin. This figure in question is also reminiscent of the 9th century horned Odin amulet from Uppland, Sweden, found in a woman's grave. The figure is believed to either be a depiction of Odin himself or of a shaman associated with the cult of Odin. He holds a sword in his right hand and what appears to be 2 spears in his left. We have the same paraphernalia in this figure in the movie, because he also has a sword, it seems to me, and 2 javelins and a horned helmet. Again, it is important to make it clear, a helmet with horns, or what appears to be horns, but are often representations of birds, possibly of ravens, Odin's ravens, in a circular movement around Odin's head or around the person incorporating the deity. We are not, of course, looking at helmets that would be used in battle. These examples are ceremonial helmets. We know indeed that in the Viking Age helmets did not have horns, and in fact it is in the Scandinavian Bronze Age that we really see helmets with horns and figures with helmets with horns, which would not be used for combat, but rather not only for ceremony and for an activity of a ritual nature, but also as an indication of a figure of power. We are in the presence of head dresses for ceremonies and cults related to the Odinic cult, right? The performance and the embodiment of the divinity in the human figure for the purpose of the ritual, a ceremonial reenactment. It is important to state that the Bronze Age in Europe and Northern Africa and the Middle East is filled with representations of figures with horns or with horned helmets. Since I am from Portugal, I take the opportunity to show you some examples which are found in the Iberian Peninsula dating to the Bronze Age, the Iberian Bronze Age. And we see several horned figures. Some are representations of gods, and others are representations of human individuals, chieftains, war chieftains, legendary warriors, figures of power. European, Northern African, and Middle Eastern Bronze Age is absolutely filled with these figures. So it is important to not let a particular historical factor get in the way of important iconographic and symbolic representations of previous eras that will continue to have some religious, cultic, ceremonial, and ritualistic weight on other periods ahead in history. The idea here is to use a type of ceremonial paraphernalia for the purpose of the cult. This is basically being dressed for the cult, dress in various ways to incorporate the gods and other entities for the purpose of ceremony, ritual, cult, religious performances. It's quite possible that we are in the presence of specific figures that would embody the divinity and in ritual ceremony would provoke a certain impact on the group of warriors observing this performance, a violent fervor as an inspiration due to the presence of the divinity embodied by an individual, a human individual. This particular belief in the presence of a deity possessing a human figure, creating this enactment, and the deity passes on its powers through the human figure onto the warriors. Now, I would just like to take the opportunity to say that here in the movie we see Amleth and others of his group half naked, covered only with wolf skins. Some of them, even Hamlet himself, ends up getting rid of his own wolf skin. Historically speaking, in terms of the art of war and medieval combat, this makes absolutely no sense. If you are going into battle, especially this very risky scene of attacking a fortified village that is clearly protected, and if you are going naked, you are an easy target, easy to spot and the first to be killed before seeing any actual action. If we look at the depictions of these warriors in material culture, they have armor. What we need to take in mind here is two important aspects. As said before, dressing in animal pelts and these head dresses and all seems to be specifically for a ceremonial purpose and not for actual combat. And if these warriors by any chance went to battle dressed as animals, their depiction in material culture, mostly from the Vandal period, show us that they were well equipped. They had armor on, aside from also the skinned animal skins, but also armor. Unless you plan on dying immediately to save yourself from aggravation, you don't go to battle naked. Even someone with a little knife could easily kill you. Stab, 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 done, next. However, this depiction isn't far from what we have mentioned in later literary sources. You see, how Bare-serkir and Þórir are portrayed in literary sources is often like this. Naked, absolutely out of their wits, biting shields, charging like animals. These specific sources are quite late in Old Norse literature, mainly Icelandic, written in a period when these warriors no longer existed and are part of legend at this point in Icelandic history, post-Christianization. These Icelandic portrayals of such warriors are often from the Christian perspective of wild pagan men from the past, often mentioned as being devoted to Odin. That part may very well be true, and coming into Iceland to raid and kidnap and rape women and children and killing all the rest. These portrayals are often with a derogatory sense, again, written in periods after these warriors no longer existed, to evoke this sense of evil doing and primitivism from the part of the pagans. We see these same portrayals from the part of other cultures, such as the Romans portraying Celts and other peoples they have fought against and conquered, often portraying them as primitive, uneducated, stupid, inferior, a degrading image. However, from the archaeological context, we clearly see that these people were not as their conquerors have portrayed them, but were actually just as well equipped as the Romans, with armor, helmets, several different weapons. We continue to see these portrayals, unfortunately, in movies. Barbarians charging aimlessly like a horde of zombies against the Romans or a well-equipped Roman armies in fighting positions and protected by large shields. The so-called barbarians were not stupid and were well equipped. They had strategic minds. It wasn't as random and chaotic as we see in movies. So seeing naked warriors like this in the movie, we are faced with a portrayal from later literary sources that even tell us of these Bare-serkir and Þórir charging naked and biting shields and whatnot. But the actual warriors were well equipped. I mean, if you are wearing armor and you have a shield defending yourself against a naked warrior charging at you, and that is now biting your shield, your enemy is cutting out your work for you. I don't know if you ever held a Viking Age shield in your hand, but if someone is biting it, you just break their teeth. And if by some magic their teeth are unbreakable, just hit them with a bloody axe right in their head. So here in the movie, charging as such naked against a protected village, there are warriors in it with armor. It would never work in real life. Vikings have been known mostly to actually raid unprotected places, mostly monasteries, churches, farms, farmsteads, where you can just walk in and take what you want and without much effort and no need to lose anyone's life. It's quite simple. Just imagine a group of naked warriors going to battle, and you can be sure that that group would not last long and will lose so many warriors in such a short time period that that group would simply no longer have the man to continue on fighting in other places. So we really are here facing the portrayal of these warriors from later literature in a more derogatory sense of legendary pagan monsters. Continue to talk about these warriors. I would just like to point to the symbology of the wolf and the bear. The wolf does not appear in the film itself, but it is portrayed symbolically through the gestures and behaviors of the warriors who walk on all fours, howl and growl. And some of them wear wolf skins, of course. In Nordic culture, the wolf was an animal that had an ambiguous symbolism, as it could represent something good or bad. In mythology, this is noticeable in the figures of Fenrir, Skoll, and Hati, in which these three wolves, during the myth of Ragnarok, kill some gods and contribute to the chaos in the world. In this aspect, these wolves symbolize threat, violence, punishment, suffering, and destruction. In turn, in the myths, it is also reported that Odin, the god Odin, had two wolves as companions called Geri and Freki, which behave more like dogs than wolves. However, these two animals do not have an expression in Old Norse mythology, but the condition of being companion animals of a god linked to war reinforces their connection with it. In the social cultural field, however, wolves symbolize strength, bravery, and ferocity, attributes evoked and desired by warriors, a condition that leads some warriors to use cloaks of wolf skin, being called hulfedin, hulfednar in the plural, which would invoke through rites the spirit wolf warrior. Something far more symbolic and of a ceremonial character. In the Volsunga saga, as said before, we have the case of King Sigmund and his son Singfjotli, who use wolf skin cloaks to attack enemies in a forest and absolutely slaughtering them all. And this idea is portrayed in the Northman, in the second act of the film, when Amleth and his companions participating in a nocturnal martial rite, wearing cloaks made of wolf skin, and they snarl and howl. And the next day, when they attack the Slavic village, they fight savagely. A more mythical representation. Some narratives mention Hulfednar and Bare-serkir participating in martial rites to enter a kind of trance and be possessed by an animal rage. But there are no descriptions of how this would be done, in what context they were performed, and who could participate in it. In addition to the fact that it is not possible to specify the historical context of such rites, nor to know specifically what they consumed to alter their psyche. However, it is noticeable that the wolf in the context of the movie also invokes an ambiguous symbolism, since in addition to representing martial values, it also represents uncontrollable violence, something present in the attack on the village in the land of the Rus. On the other hand, we have the bear symbolism. The bear is another totemic-like animal of sorts associated with warfare, but unlike the raven and the wolf, it does not appear in the movie, not clearly, although it may be suggested that some warriors of the group that Hamlet was part of would wear bear skins and thus be Bare-serkir. However, the greatest emphasis on the bear is found in the epithet of the protagonist himself, who is sometimes referred to, and he himself refers to himself as Björnulfr, bear wolf. I've already talked a lot about the bear here on this channel, and in fact in many stories there is a very sexual connotation related to the bear. But in this name for Amleth, Björnulfr, one sees the combination of bear and wolf characteristics. In the case of Scandinavian mythology, bears practically do not appear in myths, not being expressive animals like the wolf. Already in the sagas, however, the mention of bears, these literary sources mention bears as animals to be hunted, or refer to them when they mention the Bare-serkir, precisely, warriors who made use of bear skins, which entered into a wild frenzy. In Ynglinga saga suggests that Odin would bestow this altered state on such warriors. Later, the bear came to be very sexual, to become a very sexual symbolism in Scandinavian folklore, referring to a wild state of the masculine figure as a danger for young maidens. But the idea of the Bare-serkir is similar to that of the Hurfadnar, in which, in both cases, the warriors, through rites, incorporated the martial fury of these animals, entering a state of immeasurable brutality. The sagas themselves, such as Egil's saga, report that the Bare-serkir could get out of control when they were in a state of Berserkerganger, which is the fit of madness, the fury itself. An idea of this kind is seen in the attack on the village of the Rus, in which Amleth strikes a warrior, knocking him to the ground, and then bites his throat like an animal. In this respect, the bear, in the context of the movie, also represents martial values such as strength, bravery, and ferocity, but also savage violence. In the land of the Rus, we see an important historical reality, which is the slave trade. Something I am particularly satisfied for seeing this portrayal, because this aspect of history isn't often talked about. Here it is portrayed in a particularly brutal way, but historically speaking it was far worse. I'm not going to develop on this subject in this video because it is not relevant for the symbology and ritual themes we are dealing with here today. Although I just want to add that I have seen some people in academia, not many, but some, especially Scandinavian researchers, that completely deny the existence of slavery from the part of Scandinavians throughout history, be that in the Iron Age and Middle Ages or in the modern period, the very colonization of the Sami indigenous people, as an example. One thing is being ignorant about the history of one's own country. It happens. Another thing is to know the truth but choose to ignore it, or worse, pretend that it never existed. I have heard some researchers saying that Viking Age slaves were not slaves because they were paid. So it's all right then, is it? Taking people from their homes, their communities, killing off their families, beating them, raping them, forcing them to do a variety of things. But as long as you give them some coin, it's okay, right? Good grief. This is history. It is often brutal, and if we are ashamed of it sometimes, if sometimes we cannot find something to be proud of, that's all right, because really horrible things have happened. I come from a country that was one of the biggest slavers and slave traders of all time, possibly even more than Rome. The Portuguese Empire, during the colonial period, was responsible for enslaving more people than the British, Spanish, and French empires combined. I'm aware of this history of my own country, this very sad and shameful history. It's not by denying the existence of this horrible past that history will automatically become super awesome. We must speak of these things, acknowledge them, as to not fall into the same mistakes, to avoid committing the same horrible things, and to help those who still live today, right now, that still suffer, that are the collateral damage from past behaviors and mentalities that have greatly shaped, in the most horrible and brutal way, the course of human history. So I just wanted to say that, that I've just said, because I'm particularly content, satisfied with this historical representation in the movie, instead of hiding the brutal reality. Moving forward, still in the land of the Rus, shortly after the enslavement of the Slavs, we have a moment that seems in part and very subtle to have been influenced by the aesthetics of North American indigenous shamanism, but with several Slavic historical elements that are more in focus, of course. In fact, when I saw the trailer and saw Björk, who portrays Sirius here, I was a little bit confused because this is a Viking Age context film, but a character with Slavic paraphernalia appears. And I was thinking that they were making a big mixture here, possibly. Of course, obviously, after seeing the film, I was happy to see that my suspicions were partly unfounded, and I was pleased with myself because in the trailer I could see that it really was something Slavic indeed. Well, we have a representation of a prophetess or a seeress from the Slavic area. The same one wears a large headdress, but instead of feathers, they are bundles of wheat. Various Slavic goddesses were linked to wheat, of course, or even a modification of the traditional wreath of vinok flowers to a headdress. In her hands, she holds and unravels a woolen spindle, a symbolic act associated with prophecy and the Norns and the goddess Freyr, but also other female deities who are linked to destiny and with the fate of mortals. But these representations with the spindle is more prominent in Western art since the 19th century. Mind you that I am not talking about the idea of weaving, spinning and weaving threads of yarn and such in relation to destiny and shaping the fate of humans. I am talking about the visual representation of the female figure with a woolen spindle in a modern realistic, modern romantic artistic context in relation to these themes of mythology. But I think we are also in part visualizing a contemporary representation of the Slavic goddess Mokosh, who protected weaving and spinning. I don't know if that was the intention, but for me it reminds me of that goddess as well. Behind the prophetess, a statue was inserted, very similar to the quadruple pillar that was found in the region of Zubruch in Ukraine and dated from the 9th century. A four-sided pillar with several figurations, and on top the representation of four faces united beneath a tall rounded hat. There is still some dispute whether if it is a single deity with four heads, which isn't uncommon, multiple-headed deities in several ancient paganisms, and I've talked about this before on this channel in relation to the Wends, and quite this prominent representation of Eastern European paganisms of the past, or if we are in the presence of a representation of four different deities, possibly Pierum, Mokosh, Leda and Dashbog, or perhaps even Veles, or if all these representations end up being personalities of a single deity which together represent different powers of a deity. It is nonetheless a very interesting detail in the movie. Around the prophetess and the statue, there is a palisade, it seems, if I remember correctly, but the site does not look like a closed building, right? Which is consistent with archaeological research in the Rus region and not so much with the representations of Western Slavic temples closer to what is now Eastern Germany and Western Poland. In this moment, the Slavic witch, sorceress, tells Amleth to follow the fox, a vixen, to be more precise. It is important to be female, as we shall see. Then we will see the fox a few times. The fox's presence in the movie is subtle, although more explicit than that of the bear, wolf, and other animals that we will talk about further ahead. The animal appears briefly in Iceland while Amleth, living on his uncle's farm under the guise of a slave, is looking for ways to exact his revenge. At times, he hears some of the villagers or the people of the farmstead complaining that a fox is killing the chickens. Until one night he comes across the fox and she suggests that he follows her. This is a symbology that I found a little bit complicated and I wasn't able to understand well, because foxes are animals without any particular influence in Norse mythology, and in the Scandinavian culture of the Viking Age, they were mainly referred to as a nuisance for poultry breeders, in addition to be coveted for their skin. In fact, in later times in modern Iceland, some magical symbols appear to protect domestic birds from foxes, but that's about it. Well, regarding the fox, a dark blue fox, it looks like a shadow in the night. I think I am right in saying that it is a script idea by Sjón himself, one of the film's screenwriters who wrote the book Skuggabaldur, translated into English as The Blue Fox, but actually skugga or skugi means shadow in Icelandic. If you haven't read the book, I suggest you do. A little spoilers, beware. The book consists of a fantasy narrative in which a grey-blue fox guides a shepherd back to his home on a typical journey filled with obstacles. In this way, Sjón took this idea from his own book and inserted it in the film The Northman, placing the dark blue fox to help Amleth. Like the fox, it was a cunning move. However, I must say that despite the reference to Sjón's book, the author himself, I think, relied on folklore to use the fox. Concerning Scandinavian pre-Christian religiosity and Nordic belief systems referred to in some sagas, we find information about spirits which took the form of animals. These spirits could be landveithir, spirits of the land, and fylgjur, singular fylgja, auxiliary spirits of sorcerers, namely those who practice Seiðmaðr, or even the sorcerer's mind projection into animal form. The fylgjur can also be thought of as protective spirits, familiar spirits, right? Fylgjur are spirits that can take the form of young women, legendary women, or animals. Such beings are usually mentioned more in the sagas than in the Eddas. These spirits act in individual or family protection. There are different interpretations for the fylgjur, in which, in some cases, seeing them was a bad omen as it meant death. On the other hand, seeing one's own fylgja could mean that she would be there to warn of immediate danger or offer help as a form of prophecy, foresight, a warning of imminent danger. Hence, these spirits are seen as protectors, warning in advance of danger. In this case, the fylgjur could transform into different animals such as eagles, hawks, bears, wolves, horses, goats, foxes, snakes, etc. From this perspective, the fox that appears in Sjón's book and in the movie visibly has reference to this idea of being a helping animal, something seen in the belief of the fylgja in animal form. Moving on, we see the glimpse of a sorcerer when Amleth passed out and lies in the arms of Olga. Lucky bastard. And then again in Iceland we see the encounter of the protagonist, Amleth, with a sorcerer in a cave in Iceland. There's a lot to unpack in here. Now, the description of sorcerers in Viking Age Scandinavia is very rare. In fact, most of the descriptions we have of the Viking Age and Norse medievalism are late and Christian literature. Generally, the Icelandic sagas, which are the ones that give us the most information about these contexts, mention the occurrence of women involved in magical prophetic and sorcery acts. In the case of men, we have mentions of Spámæðr, Seiðmaðr, and Galdramaðr, men who practiced magic. The descriptions of these practitioners are practically non-existent in comparison with those of women, of course. In relation to the men who practiced some magical art, mostly Seiðr, we do not know whether they used different clothing, equipment, or objects than the women. All that was found in terms of material culture were female tombs or graves containing magic wands and objects such as pendants depicting high chairs, traces of plants, buckets, stools, etc. There is indeed a paraphernalia associated with female practitioners of magical arts in this context that immediately give us the notion of female practitioners of Seiðmaðr. As far as men are concerned, we only have written mentions. The problem here is that although the Icelandic sagas report several historical events since the colonization of Iceland, therefore prose narratives that are mostly based on historical events that mostly took place in Iceland in the 9th, 10th, and the early 11th centuries, the Icelandic sagas were recorded mostly in the 13th and the 14th centuries, actually. That's why we have the description of events, peoples, behaviors, and places from a Christian perspective in many points. As previously mentioned, a good example is the description of a supposed pagan temple, a heathen temple, but from a Christian perspective, which is not aware of this temple and reimagines it according to the author's knowledge. From a Christian perspective, both of the configuration of a Christian church in Iceland and how the interior space and how statues of saints are arranged, and even the transportation of Christian worship to a pagan imaginary world. That's why when it comes to the involvement of man in magic, they are usually called effeminate, dishonored. There is a connotation with the feminine as something pejorative. This has been the case since the 11th century with Adam of Bremen, a Christian, in his description of some acts in the religious procession of the deity Freyr, in which he describes the pagans, the man, as dancing and ringing bells in an effeminate, unmanly way. For this very reason, we will have some Icelandic sagas based on this Christian perspective that men who practice magic are dishonored, are effeminate, unmanly, akin to women. We have to understand that from Christian perspective, the pagan magical arts of a feminine character most especially were progressively prohibited, and from the 10th century onwards throughout Europe a much more derogatory figure of the witch began to be built and a new religious force established in the fight against such women. So the religious and the sacred feminine, especially pagan, were not seen as something positive. We are talking about a society already with a Christian perspective in the facing of patriarchal religious and political systems. In this mindset, a man who dabbles in the magical arts is even worse. The magical arts and the feminine are seen as something abominable, prohibited, and a man who deliberately enters into this world and way of life is seen as absolutely horrendous to the Christian mind. That's why we end up having literary references that such men who practice Seiðmaðr are effeminate, unmanly, dishonorable. But clearly we have the perception that such men existed and would be associated with female magic. The god Odin himself, who is mentioned in the film quite a lot, is known as a deity who seeks wisdom and the practice of female magical arts. And we have several poems and mythological tales that clearly show us a male element, a male figure, a hero or a god, seeking to know, practice and be involved in the female magical arts, usually associated with a 9 days or 9 steps or 9 phases in an initiation process. So, due to the literary references of man practitioners of Seiðmaðr as being effeminate, the movie portrays this particular sorcerer, the he-witch, as wearing women's clothing of the Viking age. He is wearing a garment called a smoker, an apron-like a dress with tortoise-shell brooches, a type of women's clothing. It's an interesting detail in reference to effeminate behavior in the sources. Another detail that I found interesting is this individual being in a cave. This reminds me of Njord's saga and Krokarev's saga, which are two of the literary sources that mention effeminate behavior by men who practice Seiðr or any other form of magic. Mainly, Njord's saga, we have exposed this idea of a male practitioner of the magical arts being effeminate and being associated with a pagan cult in Iceland in Svinafell, which is presided over by another man who makes men initiated in this cult as his women or his wives at every turn of 9 nights. Here we have a clear indication of the initiatory process and the connection or the connotation with the feminine and also a sexual character between men. I have already mentioned this on this channel, so now I just ask you to read these sagas and explore this case, or these cases. Another detail is the use of a severed head by this figure, which goes back to the mythical scene of Odin's consultation of Mimir's head, which can be read in Sigdrifumal, using the head to discover more information about the past, present, and mostly the future. We continue in this context of prophesying. Seiðr was mostly a process of divination and prophesying, generally associated with spirits of both the dead, ancestral spirits, and spirits of the natural world. There are no indications of the use of a severed head in Seiðr. Seiðr is mostly described as a ceremonial process that requires some kind of culling or chanting to attract spirits, whereby information is gained. There is also no evidence of the use of the heads of the dead for magical incantations or magical actions in ancient Scandinavia, right? So we are mostly faced with a scene in the film that relates to the tale of Odin using the head of a giant, Mimir, to obtain arcane and mantic knowledge. However, I should like to mention that the cult of the severed head is seen in many ancient societies, quite prominent in Western Europe before any indication of such actions in Scandinavia. We see this mostly in the early Iron Age of Western Europe among Celts, Celt-Iberians, Lusitanians, ancient Irish, Galicians, Vatans, Gauls, etc. So this seems to have influenced the very creation of Odin's consultation of the severed head of a giant. And I would also like to mention that, for instance, in Þorleif's Þórðarsson's story, the consultation of a severed head for the purpose of augury and acquiring occult wisdom is definitely something to be explored and bears close resemblance to the Odinic rite of the consultation of Mimir's head. Dismemberment and decapitation is something quite present in the mythic structure of Old Norse poems and sagas, being sacred objects of power and through which occultic wisdom is gained. Mimir's reanimated head in Sigdrifumal and Völuspá, Ymir's skull in Grimmismal, the decapitation of Nidhurur's sons by Völundur in Völundarkvida, etc., etc. Several examples of decapitation in ritualistic, mythic, poetic, and parasocial contexts, and the severed head may be seen as an object possessed of a certain potency or value as magical or sacred object in the pre-Christian religions of Northern Europe. However, we must be critical about this because it is not certain how far of a pagan or Christian influence in medieval Iceland this could be. There is clearly pagan context in relation to the severed head, no doubt, but it seems that in Icelandic medieval literature the severed head gained an even bigger importance, which may be due to Christianity as well, as severed heads often played a key role in medieval Christian iconography, which includes a large number of saints whose legendary martyrdoms include decapitation precisely. Of course, another detail, it looks like Robert Eggers used the look of sorcerers at the Icelandic Sorcery and Witchcraft Museum located at the village of Hólmavik in Iceland, which focuses on the witch craze in Iceland in the 17th century. Most of the collection and exhibitions are related to the history of witchcraft in modern times after the 15th century, in addition to artistic pieces that reconstitute the Icelandic folklore imaginary. Now, it seems that the director of the movie went to look for one of the living representations of this seasonal museum, a sorcerer who, on his head, he wears a cap, and in front of his forehead a strip of leather is fixed and goes down between his eyes, with a symbol of the Ægishjálmr engraved on it. Certainly, this was the main influence for the composition of the sorcerer in the movie The Northman, who also wears a practically identical cap and what appears to be the same symbol. Well, I've already talked here several times about galdrastafir, Icelandic magic staves. I've already focused on many of these symbols, including videos only for the Veikvisir and only for the Ægishjálmr. I won't repeat everything again. However, we have to stress that the Ægishjálmr, that is on the head of the sorcerer in both the museum and the film, is the pattern found after the 16th century, popularized with the Galdrabók. It has 8 radiations whose terminals are shaped like tridents, and each arm also has 3 lines. The center of the symbol is occupied by a small circle. The oldest symbol bearing a resemblance to the Ægishjálmr appears for the first time in the source Lækningakver, a work dedicated to magical cures for several ailments, 15th century, but it is different from the image popularized by the Galdrabók later on. It only has 4 terminals with tridents, and its use is also different, of course. It would be used to rid the sorcerer of hatred and persecution. This is not a symbol of the Viking Age, but it is a symbol that has a great impact on witchcraft, sorcery, and Icelandic folklore of the modern era onwards. From the 15th century, it developed and only reached the morphology that we see here in the film, and which is best known as Ægishjálmr, in the 17th century paper manuscript known as Galdrakver. The Ægishjálmr, like other images and symbols of Icelandic grimoires, are products of a cultural hybridization with the classical tradition and the Judeo-Christian magical tradition, culminating in Eastern Europe around the 14th century. And when arrived in Iceland, it is a cultural iconography reused and channeled to earlier experiences of the Scandinavian visual tradition, thus taking on a life of its own and becoming part of Icelandic culture. To finish this part of this character, we are faced with another animal symbology, that of the serpent. In the context of the movie, it seems to me that the serpent expresses 2 different meanings. To begin with, it is necessary to comment that in the Scandinavian context, the serpent was also an animal of ambiguous meanings, being representative of something good or bad. For example, in the Eddas, it is common for serpents to be associated with danger, punishment, death, the dead, and trickery. In the sagas, serpents also personify punishment, death, challenge, betrayal, but there are cases in which they appear as a symbol of protection and good luck. We must also take into account that in iconography, mostly of memorial monuments such as the Smith stone, a picture stone found in Gotland, Sweden, dating from the Iron Age, more or less between the 5th and the 7th centuries, as well as some literary sources, the snake or the serpent is also associated with symbols of protection, fertility, and mostly as a symbol of magic, usually associated with the feminine, but not only. The symbology of the serpent is varied in Northern Europe because during the passage from paganism to Germanic Christianity, it was a symbol widely used to express both similarities in beliefs, as well as a symbol that was used to convey various religious messages to facilitate the conversion of the pagans to Christianity. In some Old Norse literary sources, we see the serpent associated with women who practiced some form of sorcery or magic, being both a totemic animal symbol of sorts and an auxiliary animal spirit of the sorceress, as well as an object of a sexual and magical nature. In the sagas, it is common to find the word serpent, hormur, as a metaphor for sword, spear, the act of piercing, stabbing, battle, death, penetration, etc. Here we have the he-witch, who recommends that the prince needs to get a sword called Þráldur, the restless undead animated corpse by magic and curse, which was kept in a tomb, in a burial mound. After the explanation, the sorcerer takes a small snake or a serpent and throws it at the feet of the warrior, who, when looking at the ground, notices that the animal has turned into a rope. Here we have an interesting example, as snakes or serpents were animals associated with the underworld and the world of the dead, acting as a connection between both. And in the case of the film, the snake or the serpent turned into a rope, allowed Amleth to descend into the tomb, into the burial mound, precisely in a reference to a passage between worlds, which I found quite curious. After more or less 50 minutes of movie, Amleth descends into the burial mound to get the magical sword that will vanquish his foe and thus accomplishing his revenge. I'm not going into details on this part of the movie, or we would be here for another hour, surely. Although I find it quite curious, this part, because burial mounds are often representative of the realms of the dead. Even in archaeology, we understand this perception that the burial mound constitutes a passage into the world, or the dwellings of the dead, the How dwellers, so artifacts kept by the dead are often considered magical or possessing otherworldly power. I particularly find it interesting that in several Old Norse literary sources there is a certain sense of reincarnation or rebirth related to power objects. Usually it's in an aristocratic context, a person of noble lineage or noble birth trying to recover some item from an ancestor. It could be a ring, a belt, a sword, which contains part of the spirit or conscience of its owner, and the descendant of that person seeks to find a particular item in the burial mound of the ancestor in order to wear it and to possess the essence, the spirit of the ancestor and its qualities. It is a form of reincarnation through power items, passing on part of the spirit into the person that wears the item. But that's not what we have here. Not quite, because Amleth is not going to recover the sword of one of his ancestors. Instead, he is going to seek a blade not of this world, because it is kept by a Þráldur, a restless dead with inhuman strength. This particular idea is reminiscent of the magic sword Tyrfing in Eddic poetry such as Hervarakvida and the Hervara saga. It speaks of the shield maiden Hervor, who seeks her father's sword in an adventure into the burial place of her father, and there's the reference to the restless dead, precisely. Accounts that have influenced J.R.R. Tolkien, especially in the making of the Barrow Downs and the Barrow Wights and other restless dead of an ancestral past. We are getting close to the end, finally. Those of you who have made this far, congratulations, you are very patient people. Well, in Iceland at Fjolnir's farm, we have a small temple dedicated to the god Freyr and two priestly figures. I really liked this representation for several reasons. Finally, we have the mention of another deity that isn't Odin and or Marvel's Thor and Loki. I also liked it because, as has been said before in other videos, pagan temples in Scandinavia were rare, and mostly seem to have been in elite contexts, something private belonging to a lord, landowner, king, someone from nobility, or a wealthy person. And here we see a small temple to Freyr, precisely on the farm of someone with power, wealthy, with some status, social status. I also liked it because the representation of these cultic leaders was much more credible than those presented in other series and movies about Vikings. And indeed, any kind of Hollywood representations when it comes to pagan figures who preside over a cult or religion, which are usually represented always in strange, almost animalistic ways, sinister looking, all painted, even dirty. The film's priests are more normal. Normality is a matter of perspective, of course, but they are represented here more as everyday people rather than something outlandish in Hollywood style. Here in the film, they differ from other people in their appearance just by wearing a very simple white cloak. This is also why I liked it, because there is no indication of a priestly class in Iron Age Norse pagan context, nor an official religion, nor a group of individuals who controlled the religious being specifically dedicated to the cult as their occupation or profession. So here we have perfectly normal everyday people. Generally, temples and the cults presided in them were controlled and presided over by the elite or by the owner of the temple and his family or members of his household, including the lady of the household. At another moment, a statue with an erect penis will appear in an open space, certainly the god Freyr, deduced by the account of Adam of Bremen, and some discoveries of figurines and artifacts with a phallic character in various pre-Christian Scandinavian religions. We have, for example, the Relinje statuette, a Viking Age representation of Freyr found in Sweden, and we can clearly see the erected phallus. It's in plain sight. However, a specific temple to Freyr is something interesting that we have a few mentions of, namely Adam of Bremen once again. This 11th century German chronicler, Christian chronicler, gives us the most extensive descriptions of Viking Age religious practices. For instance, he speaks of a temple in Gamla Uppsala, Old Uppsala, around 1070, fairly late in the Viking Age, as I've said previously, although this temple has three gods, Odin, Freyr, and Thor. Although, so far, no such temple has yet been found. And, talking about Freyr, it is possible that a space of worship dedicated to Freyr alone, just for Freyr, never existed in the perception we have of temples as closed buildings. Freyr is the god of fertility, sexuality, among other things, but he is also a god connected to the burial mound and the dead, the ancestral dead. Freyr is the lord of the Alfar, the elves. Elves in the sense of some human beings upon death would become elves as entities of the earth or of the land, usually inhabiting the places where they have been buried, including burial mounds. There are descriptions of offerings to the god Freyr, deposited in burial mounds precisely, with the roof open where the offerings were thrown. This may be one of the reasons why a temple dedicated to Freyr alone has never been found, because the likely scenario is that the Old Bronze Age and Iron Age burial mounds at Old Uppsala were probably the sacred places for the cult of Freyr. Another important thing is that one of the priests in the temple of Freyr in the movie is carrying a metal object, which seems like it is iron chains. This is particularly curious because there are references by Adam of Bremen of the clattering of bells and probably other objects during the procession in the cult of Freyr. So there's this idea that religious processions to Freyr would be quite loud all the way to the place of worship and of sacrifice. There's also been found in other contexts, namely in relation to the goddess Freya, Freyr's sister, rattles and iron objects which were used to provoke a huge sound, a loud sound. It seems several metal objects were used in the procession of specific or to specific deities and their representative cultic performances. The use of metal objects to make loud sounds is still very present in European folklore to both call upon or ward off spirits. There are also several findings of buckets in Viking Age prophetesses' graves, the volur, which seem to have been used to make a hollow sound, which may have been with the intention of calling upon spirits. Loud sounds with objects and with the voice is often connected to Seiðmaðr as a performance to prophecy, to prophesy. So we seem to have this idea present of loud noises to call upon or wake up spirits, including deities. So it is a peculiar and interesting detail in the movie. I take the opportunity to say that in the movie we understand that sacrifices to be performed to Freyr, there is a particular moment in the movie in which they are ready to sacrifice a slave girl to Freyr. When Adam of Bramham speaks of the temple of the three gods at Old Uppsala, he also mentions outside the temple a well into which sacrifices are thrown. He also mentions a nearby grove whose trees were used to hang animal and human sacrifices as offerings to the gods at a festival that takes place every 90 years. Then we have one last big ritual in the movie. This is the burial scene of the son of Björnulfr. I'm not going to focus on this particular moment because there's a lot that needs to be said here, and I don't want to stretch this video too much further, and I don't want to bore you to death. If you want and think it's useful, I will make another video entirely dedicated to this moment because there's a lot to say here. So, let me know in the comments if you please. It's a trick! All I want is to force you to comment to influence the algorithm or something. However, I must say that of all the ritual scenes in the film, only one is based directly on historical sources, and that is the funeral scene we are dealing with right now. Yes, clearly the movie The Northman, whose plot is based on the story of Amleth, popularized in the 12th and the 13th century, with the book Gesta Danorum by Saxo Grammaticus, but with several modifications, of course. But this is not exactly a historical event in the sense that it really happened and we have evidences for it, but a type of literature that mixes some historical events, legends, and myths. However, the funeral depicted here for Fjolnir's son is historical, drawing on Ibn Fadlan's famous account of his visit to the Rus in the 9th century. Most of the reconstructed details come from this account, from the girl who offered herself for sacrifice and is momentarily raised to her feet with a chant, the sacrifice of the horse, to Fjolnir standing naked around the funeral boat. In the historical account, the girl is drunk with some narcotic and the angel of death, an old woman, executes her from behind with a cut in her throat. The film shows a frontal stabbing of a knife in the belly. But overall, the scene was much more detailed and believable than in productions like The 13th Warrior, 1999. If you want, I'll talk about this in another video. However, let me just talk here about the animal symbology of the horse. Horses appear at different times in the movie. In addition of being means of transportation and traction, in Scandinavian culture at the end of the Iron Age and early Norse medieval times, horses were animals associated with social and religious issues as well. At certain times, horses were among the animals associated with the elite, as were hawks, eagles, and hounds. Therefore, having many horses was a sign of status. On the other hand, horses were also animals used in sacrifices. The practice of sacrificing horses and even consuming their meat, their flesh, in a sacrificial rite was common in Viking Age Scandinavia and before that period as well. Because they were animals associated with social status, being buried with a horse was something prestigious, not a practice intended for just anyone. So here we have, in the movie, the son of Fjolnir being buried with a sacrificial horse at that very moment. However, the use of horses in funerary sacrifices was also something that traced back to ideas found in mythology itself. The god Baldur was cremated on his ship with his horse. The hero Sigurd, in some versions of the myth, was also cremated with his horses and hounds. In mythology, we also have Odin and Hermodr, who use Sleipnir, the mythical eight-legged horse, to travel to Hell, the underworld and realm of the dead. Because of this, the horse was an animal also considered a psychopomp, a means to carry or transport souls into the afterlife, as it would be a mount for the living and the dead. This condition is found in the film, towards the end, when during the funeral a horse is decapitated and its body is stretched out alongside the bodies, serving as a sacrifice to help those souls find their way in the next life. But also in the next scene and at the end when Hamlet dies and supposedly goes to Valhalla, taken by a Valkyrie riding through the air. So let's finish with that moment precisely. So, to finalize this video, when Hamlet is mysteriously taken away from Fjolnir's farm, we see a Valkyrie taking him away on horseback, and we shall see her again at the end, supposedly taking Hamlet to Valhalla when he dies. Hamlet dies in a duel with Fjolnir, surrounded by lava. In a volcano, they both die, and they are both naked and barefooted in a place hot as hell. Seems legit. But here we clearly see, I think, that Robert Eggers wanted to portray an iconic duel, that of King Arthur and Mordred, as presented in the 1981 movie Excalibur. Anyway, the image of the Valkyrie gave me chills. I really enjoyed the representation here. She seems to wear armor from the migration period, the period before the Vandal period, when there is a great movement of Germanic peoples across Europe, and Scandinavia receives an enormous continental cultural influence that will greatly modify their belief systems and will have a great impact on religiosity, bringing new cults such as the cult of Odin. Here she is not only a mythological figure, but refers to an older historical past due to her clothing, thus also becoming a legendary figure reporting to the Volsunga saga. I think a lot of people must have already talked about the detail on her teeth. If I'm not mistaken, about more or less about 130 human skulls in Norse context have been found with file teeth, nearly all of them from Sweden, either with thin or deep grooves in an horizontal fashion and very few vertical cases. This is what we see here in this Valkyrie, and for reasons I cannot explain, I have found it very sexy. Although it must be said that dental mutilation is something not unheard of all over the world in different cultures and time periods, but it is not common in Europe. However, here we have it, in the Scandinavian Viking Age, and it is, to my knowledge, the only medieval European evidences of such dental modifications and mutilation. Of the 130 known cases, only 3 are not from Sweden, 2 being from Denmark and 1 from England on a mass grave of Scandinavian men that were completely slaughtered. Of the remaining 127 cases from Sweden, about 80% have been found in the island of Gotland. If I remember correctly, all these individuals were men. So it is quite possible that this was a custom solely by the people of Gotland. And the other cases outside Gotland may have been men from that island. It is not likely, however, that the custom itself originated in Gotland but was picked up from somewhere else outside Europe, probably by Vikings of the area. Vikings in the sense of occupation or profession going abroad on maritime endeavors. For some reason, this custom was brought to Gotland, and there it seems to have been a central place or gathering point of a group who distinguished themselves by these markings on their teeth. There have been many suggestions, of course, as to why these marks were made, but there isn't a definitive conclusion. It has been suggested that they were warriors, although there are no signs of that, both due to the absence of trauma to the bones common in human osteological remains of warriors, and the composition of the graves doesn't show any signs of such. It has been suggested that they were of the elite, maybe aristocracy from Gotland, but again, there are no signs that these men with filed teeth were from the elite, rulers, leaders, chieftains, or anything. Some have suggested, of course, that this was a mark given to slaves, but not only this wasn't definitely a way to mark slaves, but if it were slaves, there would be far more examples, I think. It remains a mystery. Probably a custom picked somewhere else by Gotlanders, and it remained a thing among them, precisely in the Viking Age. Although this Valkyrie is presented as a legendary figure from before the Viking period. One particular detail I like in this figure is that her cloak has long white feathers, and her helmet, or in her helmet, there seems to be a representation of a swan, and this is a very important and huge tiny detail. And now I kind of regret not having made a video yet about the connections between Valkyries, Valkyrjur, and the animal symbology of the swan. There are several instances that speak of Valkyrjur that shapeshift into swans, but the important detail here is that they are the choosers of the slain, often connected to the god Odin, and taking warriors into Valhall, the afterlife hole for those who die in battle. But not just any common warrior, but the warriors of the elite, of the nobility, who die in battle, and the afterlife place reserved for them is one presided by Odin as the god ancestor of the Scandinavian aristocracy, which is fitting here since Amleth, well, doesn't necessarily dies in battle, but dies by the sword in a legendary combat, and he is the son of a king, he is royalty, so his place is Valhall. But the swan symbology, it is important to spare a few moments here for that. The presence of the swan is quite subtle, but I think it is represented here, and it makes perfect sense. This animal is depicted on the Valkyrie's red cloak, long white feathers, and helmet. In Scandinavian mythology, the swan is not a bird that has great prominence, as in the case of the raven, the eagle, the hawk, the falcon, and the rooster. The swan rarely appears, having more prominence in other more elaborate tales of a legendary character, sagas, and romanticism around the female figure. However, in some stories, this white bird had a connection with the Valkyries, the spirits responsible for leading the souls of the dead warriors to Valhall and Folkevanger, the place presided over by the goddess Freyja, who receives part of those who die in battle. It is important to point out that the Valkyries do not always appear as spirits. There are narratives in which they assumed a human form and lived among humanity, even getting married. Something of the kind is seen in the poem Völundar Kvíða, the poem of Völund, which tells the story of Prince Völund, who was a skilled blacksmith and goldsmith, and who was kidnapped by King Nidhur and forced to work for him. In the plot, the protagonist and his brothers marry Valkyries that turned into swans, precisely. But over time, Valkyries have become quite romanticized, especially this idea of taking the dead into the afterlife. In earlier literature, the Valkyries, Valkyrjur, are brutal, cruel, and frightening spirits, being related to battle magic and also weaving the fate of battle and of those who die in battle. They use body parts and entrails to weave the fate of those who are to be killed in combat. They are quite gruesome in their magic. They are powerful spirits of carnage, death, and slaughter. In fact, I think it is safe to say they enter in the group of spiritual entities called the Disir, which are specifically feminine beings, be those ancestors, goddesses, or otherwise, and they can be both beneficial and harmful. We know of celebrations to the Disir, specifically honoring the feminine entities for both beneficial aspects and to avoid the more harmful aspects characteristic of certain feminine beings. In fact, in the movie, if I'm not mistaken, Fjolnir curses the Disir precisely. So there is this sense here of something more grotesque, harmful, and evil to it. In any case, the swan for the ancient Norse symbolizes the skies, but it would be associated with destiny, fate, something seen in the Valkyries, as they were psychopomps that led the souls of the dead warriors. In Gylfaginning of the prose Edda, it is reported that swans lived in the well of Hurdr, where the Norns, the goddesses of fate, dwell. And in this later literary source from the 13th century, part of this connotation between Valkyries and fate is preserved. Therefore, it is clear that this bird had a celestial connotation or a celestial connection, and with destiny as well. In the case of the movie, this double symbolism was maintained, I think. For Amleth, in a state of hallucination, he sees a Valkyrie leading him on her horse as she rides through the night sky towards the gates of Valhall, which meant that his fate was complete and he achieved what he was destined for. As has been said, the swan is associated with Valkyries, and Valkyrie is in turn associated with Odin and Freyr, and this question of the whole of the dead in the afterlife. There is an interesting monument, the runic stone of Standa 1, where we find precisely a very distinct bird representation, which is quite different from the majority found in other monuments, which are usually ravens or eagles or hawks. In this 11th century stone, three men are walking and holding weapons that look like a spear, hammer, and sword. This could be, of course, representations of deities or living warriors. But now, just above, a large bird seems to observe two people sitting around a man who holds the spear of one of the seated figures. There have been many ideas to explain this image. Some are more inclined for the representation of three deities being Frigga, Odin, and Freyr. However, we seem to have here a warrior who arrives at Odin's halls, where he takes a symbolic oath when touching the spear of this god, who in turn is sitting on his throne beside his wife Frigg, or perhaps an afterlife place shared with Freyja, because the other seated figure seems clearly to be the representation of a woman. In this scene, the bird has a different form from other birds, having a long neck and big legs and long beak, similar to a swan. We are therefore before a bird that is represented here as belonging to the celestial plane, being both outside and inside, as if entering and observing the arrival of the dead warrior to Odin's hall, a Psychopomp spirit. This is not the only monument that represents a swan, but it seems that we continue to have the bird associated with a heavenly plane, the afterlife, and perhaps being a Valkyrie that transported the warrior to Odin's hall. We continue to understand this connection, these aquatic birds, which are one of the most frequent motifs in picture stones that represent destiny and afterlife and a heavenly plane, often combined with ships of the dead, which are also connected to Valkyries, representing an ancient Germanic conception of a psychopomp animal. I really enjoyed this moment. Alright, this is it, my dear friends. Tell me what you think of this talk I've been having here with you. Tell me if you would like a video concerning the funeral rite or the funeral ritual to Fjolnir's son. I'll be attentive to your criticism as long as it is meant to be constructive. Let me know if I have missed something, because I only saw the movie once, but it took me like 4 hours, almost 5 hours to see it, because I was constantly pausing to take notes. But I may have missed something, of course, it is possible. I will definitely see it again without having to think about all the details and just focusing on this artistic work, so I can get some entertainment out of it. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it was useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell, my dear friends. Until we meet again.